Okay, this is part two of our discussion of decision making. I'll skip over these learning objectives and go directly to the content of this discussion. We have concluded a little bit of a discussion of bias, and we'll talk about it a bit more and then move into more of a discussion of uncertainty and also of the potential for groupthink in group decision making. I would like to start with this diagram or drawing from figure 5.3. I think it's very likely that many of you have seen this before. It's used very commonly in training programs and in management courses like this one. If you look at that, depending on how you look at it and what you're thinking when you look at it, you could either see a very old woman who has on a dark shawl and has her head down with dark bangs and a white scarf over her head, or it could be that you see a young woman in a fur who is turned toward her right shoulder, and you're seeing her chin and the side of her eye and her ear, and her hair is dark, and she's wearing a white sort of cape or scarf over her hair. So in one case, what is an ear on the young woman is an eye on the older woman. What is the nose on the older woman is the chin on the younger woman. And so a lot of different people will look at this. Some people see both and can easily flip back and forth between both images. Some see one and can't see the other. The point is, it is both. There's no question it's both. And it just illustrates, it's just a way to illustrate the idea that even the exact same information, the exact same drawing presented to two people can be interpreted in different ways. So it's an illustration of that idea that when information is presented, it is presented to an individual who brings to that their own perceptions and biases. Okay, I want to introduce the idea of mental models. Mental models refer to sort of how we simplify information and store information in our minds and how we structure it. So with experience, we develop mental heuristics. Those are rules of thumb or shortcuts and ways of simplifying complexity so that we can filter out extraneous information and make decisions faster. And generally, we would argue that that kind of mental model, a strong mental model, is a function of experience and is a very good thing, and it can improve and increase our speed of decision making. So that's great as long as our mental model is consistent with reality. But the day that it is no longer consistent with reality, as it says here, the writing on the wall cannot be read. We just can't see it. It's like somebody speaking a different language because we learned it one way, and now it looks like everybody's speaking a different way. The idea of mental model can be generalized to that of the sort of a shared mental model held by an organization, and that is referred to as dominant logic. You'll hear some organizations talk about their dominant logic. Sometimes they refer to dominant logic as a very positive thing. It's really a combination of mission and culture, if you want to think of it that way. It's the set of beliefs about the firm and industry, what works, what doesn't, the capabilities of competitors, where the opportunities are, what is a threat, how do we define success, what did we do badly in the past, that kind of thing. And often they are developed as a result of the experiences and the values of the founders. And it becomes part of the culture, as we talked about last time, of the organization. So it can be reflected in the pattern of decisions made over time, things like the priorities of the firm and how resources are allocated. But again, a dominant logic, just like a mental model, can get out of sync over time. As time passes, industry conditions change, and the capabilities of competitors change. So for example, a good example of this kind of idea is a company that has been very successful in producing high quality products and has won orders in the marketplace based on quality for years. An example that I know of is a company called Baldor. It's an automotive parts supplier. And they had were very, very successful over the years in selling products that were very high quality products. But as competition changed, more and more companies were able to do a lot of what they were able to do, and they were able to do it less expensively and therefore charge a lower price. And so even though they continued to push quality and to believe that customers would continue to buy from them because they were steadily increasing their quality, in reality what was happening is they were overshooting what their customers needed. And their customers were becoming, as things were becoming more commodity-like, their customers were becoming more concerned with price. And when they were able to get quality that was good enough at a lower price, they started buying from other people. And for a company like this one that has gone through its entire corporate history pushing to improve quality, it is extremely difficult for it to wrap its mind around the idea that improving quality is not going to allow them to hold on to their customers, that their customers will not pay any longer for quality that is above and beyond what they need to be successful in their own businesses. Some years ago, I began to struggle with the idea of how to teach the idea of uncertainty. I felt that in some ways, in the strategy classes that I was teaching and in the books I was using, that we were simplifying the idea of uncertainty too much. It was almost as if, things were uncertain only because we hadn't looked hard enough to get the information. So it was used as evidence that we had not structured the kind of analysis needed or had not conducted the type of search that was needed in order to get the information to make it no longer uncertain. And I began to draw on some of what the military has taught for many years about uncertainty and to build that into the content of my classes. And so I want to use this 2x2 that I have put together to illustrate that idea. So we're going to use these 4 quadrants. The one on the top left describes what we know, what we might agree upon as the facts. So we would be arguing there's no uncertainty associated with what's in the top left box. If we go to the top right box, though, we would describe that as what we know we don't know. Now, this is maybe beginning to sound a little bit like Donald Rumsfeld because he was ridiculed in the press, a decade and a half ago about his use of the phrase, what we know we don't know, and what we don't know we don't know. But those are common terms. So what we know we don't know is also referred to as the known unknowns. That would be things like the interest rate next, in the next couple of months. Something else we know we don't know would be if we're going to go into a recession in the next year or so. So there are things that we know and we're concerned about, we're aware of, but we know we don't know them. And when we dig into this a little deeper, we'll talk about, well, why is that? Why don't you know? And is there a reason for that? If we drop down to the bottom left, that quadrant represents what we don't know we know. Okay? So that's like unknown knowns. Now, what does that mean? That's odd. We haven't heard anybody talk about that before. But what it refers to is the idea that within some organizations, there's embedded knowledge and tacit understanding and ways of doing business, just understanding, as I say, where it influences the decisions you're making. It's relevant, conceivably, very relevant information, but you haven't articulated it, you haven't clarified it, you haven't made it explicit as part of the decision process. So we don't really recognize that we're making use of that and that we know it. And it could be that we know it but fail to recognize it in a dangerous fashion. So we'll come back and talk about that one as well. And the final block, the one on the bottom right, is what we don't know we don't know. Again, the unknown unknowns. And, that's the nature of surprise. We could argue that, of course, 9/11 was a surprise. We can make the argument that for the vast majority of people, the economic collapse in 2007, 2008, the now called Great Recession, was something we didn't know we didn't know, that kind of thing, that it was a surprise. Now, it wouldn't be that way for everybody. There were some people who could have predicted, something like that collapse, and there were certainly other people who would have been anticipating a significant terrorist attack. But at the same time, for the vast majority of people, they would fall into those categories of we don't know, we don't know. Okay, so let's dig a little deeper into each of these. In our first quadrant here, we are talking about what we know. And so this is really the facts as we know them. And then the question is, are these facts true, or is it possible they're biased or just inaccurate perceptions? The key here is to think about that first figure that I showed you when we started this, of the old and young woman. So you could have a group of people come into a room and all agree that that was a figure of an older woman, and they would be right. That would be a fact, and there would be agreement. But the reality is it's incomplete. It's not all of the facts. It's not a completely accurate representation of what that drawing shows. And so there are some biases or inaccuracies, incomplete perceptions there that would influence that finding. Okay, now what we know we don't know. So then we want to ask ourselves very quickly, why don't we know? If there's something, if, for example, if we know we don't know if the interest rates are going to go up. The question is, why don't we know? Is it something that is knowable now if we just look harder? Or is it something that is only knowable later? So an example would be if suddenly a company loses market share. Say, in a particular month, sales suddenly drop off. Customers have turned to a competitor's product, and so they are sitting there flat-footed saying, this caught us off guard. We don't know why our customers have defected to this other competitor, and what can we do about that? Well, they don't know, but it is knowable why their customers defected. And so they could interview those customers. They could try to observe what the competitor has designed and offered in the terms of their sales contracts. They could try to purchase a couple of samples of the product that was sold to try to figure out what attributes or what quality standards are now causing it to be better. So that kind of competitive intelligence and market survey would be something that would allow them to know now what has happened. So they may not know, but they could know. And something like interest rates would be knowable later. Some things are not going to be known. You're not going to be able to know them until they happen. The third quadrant is what we don't know, we know. So as I mentioned, this is the idea of tacit knowledge that's used but not specifically acknowledged or articulated. So that could be long understood methods of production. It could be sort of the knowledge embedded in the brains of your R&D staff. It's information that is relevant, but that the rest of the organization doesn't know, and if that individual leaves, that knowledge leaves with them. So it could be also that it could be sort of these embedded beliefs and mental models. And that can actually be something that could be negative rather than positive, right? Embedded beliefs and mental models, as I mentioned, can be a really strong source of advantage for a company. It's the essence of experience if those mental models continue to be accurate. But when mental models are no longer representative of reality, then mental models lead to bias. Another way of thinking about what we don't know we know is the idea that knowledge sometimes just doesn't make it through the political filter. So information that is known by some members of the organization is in essence blocked or not passed on to those who should know that information. So it's as if the organization doesn't know it, but it has it embedded somewhere. An example of that, of course, is the Challenger disaster. As many of you know, I'm sure, that there were people inside NASA who knew that they should not be taking off that day and who tried to get that word to people who would stop the flight, but it did not happen. It could be that there's relevant information that is just ignored because it's considered to be unimportant. But the idea here is, you may well have the knowledge, or you may be relying on knowledge internally that is inconsistent, maybe with what's, what the reality is. And then finally, what we don't know, we don't know. So this is the idea of surprise, as I mentioned, the nature of surprise. In fact, following 9/11, the military contracted with several organizations to conduct research on the nature of surprise. And the idea was, to try to cultivate a bigger imagination about what was possible. And some of you, if you're old enough to remember, and most of you would not be, I suspect, but if you were old enough to remember, you would remember that the military and maybe even the State Department went to great lengths to enlist creative thinkers, people, movie makers and writers, to help think through what the possibilities were, because in some ways they felt that movies had sort of tapped into what the potential might be for terrorist attacks that were a little more imaginative than what maybe the military was preparing for at the time. I'm not sure that's true, but that was some of what we read after 9/11. So it was a pretty big deal. So the question is, what is unknowable? Was it unknowable? Was it a failure of imagination, or willful or naive ignorance, just not being willing to face the evidence that's there? Or is it a failure to look in the right place? That standard cliche argument that's made all the time, or the illustration, I should say, that's given all the time about, someone looking for a lost piece of jewelry and is standing under a street light looking for a lost piece of jewelry, and someone says, "Oh, did they drop the jewelry here?" He says, "No, they dropped it over there, but this is where the street light is. This is where the light is." That's a laughably stupid example, but it is a cartoonish illustration of the idea that you tend to look where you can get information rather than looking where it's more complex and difficult, but more likely to be successful. So anyway, I just like to throw this out because I like to be provocative and to get people to think a little bit about the idea of uncertainty and how uncertainties that business face, those uncertainties come from a variety of different sources. So sometimes the source of that uncertainty is your own bias. Sometimes that uncertainty is from not looking hard enough, not trying hard enough to get the information. And sometimes it's because it's embedded inside the organization and that there are biased mental models preventing it from surfacing. And sometimes it's because we didn't look at all, didn't anticipate it, maybe a failure of imagination. Okay? Let's talk for a minute about group decision making. Certainly a tremendous amount of decision making that takes place in businesses is a group decision-making process. It sometimes is a group process that's formal, where everyone gathers around a table, considers common information, or brings their own input into the decision process, and a decision is made by the group. In other instances, it's a group decision, although one person may be responsible for making the decision formally. There's input from a lot of different people, but the whole concept here is that there's input from multiple people. And so it is the case that group decision making can be superior to individual decision making. individuals would have more restricted, limited knowledge, might be subject to some forms of bias. And by introducing additional people into the decision process, if you handle it properly, it can be that you can reduce the likelihood of bias. Now, that doesn't mean at all that it's automatic that it will reduce bias, because it could be that everyone in the group has the same set of biases. If people have tended, as we talked about in an earlier chapter, an earlier week, if people tend to surround themselves with those who have similar backgrounds, similar education, similar work experience and life experiences, it can be the case they all are subject to the same types of biases in decision making. It also is the case that sometimes in meetings and people are unwilling to disagree with the person who's holding the meeting. They don't want to come across as argumentative or anything like that. So it's something that you have to deliberately cultivate, and we'll talk about that shortly. But the idea that you can draw on the skills of a lot of different people, bring a lot of different opinions to bear is an attractive idea. It allows you to generate more alternatives. It can allow managers to then have more information available to them. And also it encourages buy-in, so that if people have a voice in a decision that has to be made, they generally are more willing to accept that decision when it's made and implemented. And so that's another reason for involving multiple managers or multiple individuals in a group decision. There is a problem, though, with group decision making, and that is a possibility, a tendency to devolve into groupthink. Again, in the history of the study of groupthink, one of the areas that is the highest profile example of really serious groupthink was in the Kennedy administration, associated with the Bay of Pigs and other activities involving Cuba. You can read about that. There's some extraordinary reviews of that and the problem of groupthink. But it's the idea that everybody in the group leaves agreeing on a decision, when in reality it was kind of all about getting to agreement. Nobody was interested in contradicting anyone else. No one was interested in challenging anyone else. Now, sometimes people agree and leave a meeting in agreement because they really value consensus. Other times it's because, as shown in the bottom part of the slide, it's because of peer pressure. Maybe it's because they feel pressure to conform. They want other people to like them. They don't want to be the one to disagree or to challenge, and they rationalize that it's probably better to go along with this decision. And so even though they might not really go along with it, there is an illusion that everybody has gone along with it. Well, that's a complete waste of time, because then what you've done is pulled a group together. All they've done is validated the decision of the first person to speak up, or whoever the leader is, and it's created the impression that everyone else has vetted the decision just as thoroughly, when in reality no one has, and everyone has gone along with it. It's a very, very dangerous situation to be in. So how can you avoid groupthink? One is just to be mindful of it and to work to avoid it. So one way to do it is to make sure that anyone who offers up information, that they have to specify the assumptions underlying their information, a full list of alternatives that are being considered. So they have to document the decision process. Say, this is what information we pulled together. These are the assumptions we had to make. This is the decision process that we went through. And then what you want to do whenever you have to make decisions as part of a decision-making process is challenge those individual assumptions. So what if assumption 1 is not true? What if assumption 2 is not true? What if assumption 3 is not true? And you use that to challenge your decision. You also, item 2 here, want to encourage debate. You want to stress with any group you pull together that conflict is okay. It's not really conflict, I should say. Disagreement does not have to be conflict. So it really is disagree, challenge. It doesn't mean you are in direct conflict. And frankly, even if you are in conflict, that's better than making a bad decision. So let people brainstorm, meaning go around the room and ask each person to offer up ideas where people are not allowed to edit or criticize until they have fully presented their thoughts. Try, as it says, to involve different personalities, different styles of thinking, and individuals who are not friends. One of the biggest problems is if you get a whole bunch of people that are close friends in a room, then whoever is sort of the dominant individual in that group will offer up something, and the others are not going to disagree because it's their friend, and they're not going to disagree. Sometimes it's better to maintain an arm's length relationship so people are willing to disagree. Recognize biases in data. And again, that's that idea of pulling out the specifics and any assumptions that you might make. Make all of the data public so everybody can see what led to the decision that was made. You can even create an actual devil's advocate in the room, and that is to appoint someone to challenge, to say, I'm going to take the opposite position on everything that is said. So when somebody articulates an assumption, they come back with, well, what if we assume the opposite of this? And then if somebody says, these are the facts as we see them, show me where did you get those facts? Show me what if you have omitted some facts, and have them challenge the alternatives that are developed and the decision that's made. And then finally, when decisions are quite complex, it is very useful to pull together a true red team. A red team is an independent team of individuals who are equally qualified to make the decision, but not tied to the first group. And the red team will then move through the entire process systematically, assessing all of the same assumptions and the alternatives and the decisions that are made and the ultimate recommendation, and really challenge the thinking about it. And if the red team, if you use a devil's advocate, and then you end up with a red team that's in consensus, then all you can say is you may not have made the right decision, but you did as good a job as you possibly could have to ensure that you made a good decision. You tried your best at that point. You didn't just wing it and hope for the best. Okay, that is the end of our chapter. Well, it's not chapter 4, but class 4 on decision making, and the second part. So I will see you in week 5.